966.
We're speaking now with Joshua Yaphe, State Department resident expert in Middle East affairs and author of the recently published book, Saudi Arabia and Iraq as Friends and Enemies, Borders, Tribes, and a Shared History. Joshua, thank you so much for joining us today on the 966.
Thank you.
Josh, I'm just really excited that you've joined us. You know, I lobbied a little bit. We finally got you. You're a new father. You're exceptionally, you've just published a book. You've been working on your doctorate. You've been exceptionally busy. There's an important thing that needs to happen here, though, because if you would just listen to our introduction, you know, one would think you were just a policy wonk. And I want to state clearly here that Josh has, through his interest, his curiosity, his network of friends, has built an extraordinary network of people, from the region, in the U.S., academia, diplomacy, that sort of thing. That he's become just a really unique convener of people, getting people together, practitioners in a particular area from cross disciplines and sectors. We did some research on I'm going to share this, this screen, the U.S. Middle East Expert Network. Can you see that, Josh?
That's cute. You can take that down. That's embarrassing. It's not even true.
This is true. And we had two options. We had the Middle East Expert Network, or we had 6 degrees of Josh.
That's ridiculous.
6 degrees of Josh
ridiculous.
Took extraordinary amounts of paper.
I'll have nothing to do with this. I don't even associate myself with this.
And by the way, I will send you this file, Josh, to put on your wall.
It's an NFT, actually.
Okay, look, can I get started then if you've had your fun?
All right. So now we're on our way.
Okay, look. We'll come back to this later, the idea of what it means to be a Middle East expert in Washington, but I just want to say one thing about that. When I started all this, I was trailing around my mom, who herself had spent 40 years as an expert on Iraq and Iran in Washington. And the people I met and the things I saw, the events I attended, were very different from today, starting with the individuals involved. So many Middle East experts in her era, we're talking from the 90s to the early 2000s, when she was doing public events and public speaking and think tank roundtables and the like, after she had done quite a number of years in the intelligence community in the United States, that the people in that circle, in that orbit, the elder generation, when I was just getting started, so many of them had had a previous background in the US government. They were, by and large, born and raised in America. They had served years, decades in government service, often in the intelligence community, either in military intelligence or the CIA or other elements of the US government in intelligence capacity. And they had then gone into the think tank world and into academia with that shared experience, with that shared background. And with that came a number of things, not just a knowledge of obscure issues, obscure at the time, because if you go back to the mid-90s, there weren't a lot of people that were experts on Yemen or experts on Saudi Arabia for that matter. But they had more than just a knowledge of what at the time were niche issues. They had a mutual respect and admiration for what each other had been through in those careers. And they brought that with them when they entered into the public sphere, when they became think tank experts and the like. They, by and large, could disagree on issues, on policies, on ideas, and yet still defer or show each other a level of respect that I'm not going to say it doesn't exist today. Respect certainly exists, but in a different way, a qualitatively different way. And I don't know how to describe it. I try to get at this in the preface of the book, the change that I've witnessed over time from when I was sort of in an apprenticeship mode many, many years ago till today, where I feel I have a sense of who's out there, what they're doing, and what they're up to. I think that what once existed in terms of networks, in terms of asabiya, if you want to call it that, in a very DC sense, among Middle East experts, that's been replaced to some extent. It's a different world of people who now occupy expert positions in Washington, in academia, in think tank world, etc. And even within the government, people who do these types of jobs have different types of motivations. It's rare that you meet people that want to dedicate their entire careers to one country, okay? Which was not uncommon in my mother's day among people doing Middle East. You look at Ken Katzman or Ken Pollack, Dan Byman, these people who really dedicated careers to one country or two countries or a small subunit of the region, spending decades going back again and again to research these places. It's changed. A lot of things have changed, and some for the better. You have so many more Arab voices that have come into Washington, so many people from the region who have come in and now attempt to advise or consult or to lend their expertise. And I suppose there's a benefit to that as well. But there is a different sense of belonging or a different sense of tribalism than there once was. And we can lament it, or as I do in my book, we can question what that meant to begin with. Maybe that sense of expertise never fully existed the way I once thought it did, or the people involved once thought it did. Maybe there was a cliquishness to this crowd, if you go back 3 decades, that wasn't necessarily expertise, but was simply a level of familiarity, a professional familiarity. Who knows? It's hard to say. Everything is subjective. I like to think that there was a qualitative difference in how people reacted and responded to one another once upon a time. And that what we see today in this field is a little more tactical and a little more transactional. And I think what I've tried to do in the last 10 years or so is to get back to that sense of community that at least I imagine once existed. I hope it once existed. I hope that what I saw 20 years ago when I was coming up was real and not just my imagination or my idolization or hero worship of my elders. But I hope that it was real, and that type of sense of community, of real community, not just I'll do you a favor by inviting you to my think tank event in a fancy European capital. In return, I expect you to give me a chance at a publication with your institution, et cetera. And that way we will build partnerships in a sense. That this so-and-so is useful because what he's done lends legitimacy and credibility to our institution by affiliation with him. And in return, there may be funding opportunities down the road for fundraising. I would like to think that that's not where the profession ends, but that's where the profession begins, or that's only one part of what this profession is all about. And that there is another side to it, which is building long-term relationships of trust and confidence and friendship. Because one thing is for certain, if you're going to spend 40 hours a week doing a job, I should hope that you enjoy the people you're working with, because that's a big chunk of your life that you're spending with them. And so I'd like to have surround myself and spend my time with people who I respect and who I care about and who I enjoy the company of. Because at the end of the day, that's the most important thing. Someday, all of our jobs may be replaced by artificial intelligence. There's companies already working on that for Middle East studies. I know 2 of them that I've met in passing already. All of our jobs may be computerized or automated. All that may be left are the chances that we have as human beings to enjoy our company with each other. And so I hope that I've been able to foster some sense of community and camaraderie in the last few years among like-minded people who aren't interested in the transactionalism or the favoritism necessarily, but who also care about building long-term relationships for the sake of it and not only for the sake of career. So all flowcharts aside, I find it to be important. Thoughts, Richard? I mean, any ideas?
I really appreciate you sharing that. And you talk about, I guess, the term maybe the collegiality that of your mother's era, who's legendary. It helps me put into context a bit by of what you're doing. And our crack graphics team put that together, and partly as in good humor, but there's truth in that, because there is nobody. I'm not a Washington insider, but as far as I know, there is nobody who is, as I say, as affable and a welcoming convener as you are, and overseas, or if you're in the region, in the Gulf, they might call them salons or diwaniyas or that sort of thing. And it really is. I think people see it sort of Josh's diwaniya. It's an opportunity for like-minded people who appreciate and respect each other. And as you say, over time have built up, a trust with one another. And I think it's a unique service. Service is the wrong term. It's a unique privilege to be part of it, and I think it's a treasured contribution to the dialogue that you have fostered. And I don't say that lightly, and I don't say that because you're a guest on our show, and I don't say that because you're a friend of mine. I say that because there's nothing else like it. What you do, nobody else does in Washington, D.C.
Well, it's one of the nice things in my position, in my job. The most I've found over the years, the most valuable thing you can do in Washington for anybody is to introduce him or her to someone else who has common interests. You don't have to share any information. You have to share any knowledge. You don't have to share anything specialized or secretive. You can just be yourself and be a nice person and introduce one friend to another. And already by doing that, you're helping to foster relationships and connections that wouldn't normally happen. Too many people in this town are too closeted or too protective of their contacts, of their Rolodex. And the greatest service that any one person can do in the city is to share who they know with others.
And not everybody looks at it that way, which adds particular value to the fact that you do, especially as well connected as you are, and well connected. I'd say, as I said at the beginning, because of your curiosity, your effort to reach out, your openness. So, I mean, these are all things that I've discovered, and I think our viewers and our listeners hope they understand that.
It's very nice of you, but let's get to actual substance. I just want to say at the beginning, everything I'm saying in this lecture today is my personal views. None of it reflects the U.S. government or the views of the U.S. government. I'm appearing in my personal capacity, and I have permission from the department to do this. And I want to thank all the folks at the department, including the press and public diplomacy folks at the NEA Bureau, for their kind permission and support for allowing me to appear in my personal capacity today. Let me go back, take a step back, and just explain why I chose this topic. When I started the research years ago, I had a number of ideas that I was interested in working on. I wanted to do a topic that would be domestic politics in the Arab Gulf states of some sort. What does that mean, domestic politics? It's hard to define, yet it exists. There are constituencies, they do interact with ruling elites. And there's a type of personal politics that results from it, as I think any leading Gulf expert would acknowledge. So I had a number of ideas. First, I happened to meet Adel Tarefi, who at the time was Minister of Information. I had a chance to talk to him privately here in Washington. The first idea I threw out for a topic was this idea of Iraq-Saudi, but I was mostly interested at the time in Najdis living beyond the borders, particularly Zubair. Zubair is this town on the Iraqi side of the border, which was a little Najdi outpost for trading, for commerce. Najdi families living there who had left for whatever reason, for multiple reasons in the 18th and 19th centuries, settled there and then would use the access to Basra, the access to
Josh, let me interrupt real fast.
Yeah.
For our listeners. Define Najdi.
Well, I'll get to that. So, and that's a tough one to define. It's not easy.
But just geographically, roughly, I know it's not. It's a moving target. But just for our listeners,
I mean, there's no one book that defines Najdi geography or Najdi identity. But generally speaking, Saudi authors tend to talk about the Jabal Tuareg. In the middle of the Najd, there's a mountain range that runs north-south in the center of the Arabian Peninsula. And the land on either side is definitely considered to be Najd central. When you start to get farther south or north, there's a general consensus that the Wadi Dawasir, for instance, south central Arabia, is generally part of Najd and the valley that runs through the Dawasir territory. And farther to the north, the Raudat Sudair, and when you get farther north from that, Qasim is definitely or generally considered part of Najd, though some Qasimis will say that Qasim is its own emirate going back to the 18th century. When you get farther, you get into Hayil. Well, Hayil was acknowledged as its own emirate for quite a while. And yet there are people that believe that Hayil is Najdi in nature, Najdi in character. And there are people in Jawf, when you get even farther, closer towards the Iraq border, who would say that Jawf is part of the Najd. There are people who would say that Jawf is its own territory, its own polity. There's no single definition of where these borders extend. And there was never at any point a single political authority that controlled them all. So
but
it's hard.
Is it correct to say that the Najd and Najdis are sort of the foundational building block of the Saudi Arabia in terms of Ibn Saud?
You look at how the people around Ibn Saud defined Najdi, right? Because in these negotiations going on with Iraq about who is a citizen, which tribes belong to which state, there was a lot of back and forth, and some of it's recorded verbatim in the notes of the meetings. At one point, Abdullah Damluji, this quasi-foreign minister, the director of foreign affairs in the original directorate of foreign affairs for Saudi Arabia, for the kingdom of Najd, in his negotiations with the Iraqis, he does make an argument at one point that anyone who's Wahhabi should be considered a citizen of Najd, a citizen of Saudi Arabia. But that's rare. And even he seems to walk that back and say, well, this is just one cultural marker among many. The Saudi state at its beginning wants to claim citizenship for Sunni Arabs who self-identify as Najdi, wherever they may live. Mm-hmm. The Saudi state at the beginning, Ibn Saud, argues for a corridor for trade for his citizens to be able to go all the way to Syria. There are certain tribes, certain clans that traditionally traded in caravans all the way up to Syria, and he expected some sort of extraterritorial status that would allow them to continue doing that without needing visas, without needing passports, despite the British link between Jordan and Iraq. It's not that the goalposts keep moving. It's that the people around Ibn Saud have a little bit of an amorphous definition themselves of what Najdi means. But it's important to note, it's not just a matter of being Salafi. It's not just a matter of being Wahhabi, however you want to define that. The only intellectual of the time who tries to define Najdi nationalism is one of the only people, is this really interesting thinker, Suleiman ad-Dakhil. And talking about him is very illustrative of everything that we're getting to in this lecture and the book I'm writing. Because who is Suleiman ad-Dakhil? Well, on the one hand, his family is intermarried with the Al Saud. On the other hand, his family is also intermarried with the Al Rashid in Hayil, the mortal enemies of the Al Saud, who are laid siege by Ibn Saud for quite a while and eventually overtaken in Hayil. His family straddles both sides of the divide. He himself is a writer, and he becomes a newspaper editor, sets up his own newspaper, Al-Riyad, in its first incarnation. But where does he do this? He doesn't do it in the Najd. Even though he's propounding the Najd, his newspaper is called Al-Riyad, he's talking about Najdi nationalism left and right and center, but he sets it up in Iraq, and he lives most of his time in Baghdad, right? This is the place of intellectuals. And he has no problem moving back and forth between Baghdad and Saudi Arabia. But when he tries to define what it means to be Najdi, he says, and I quote, "The people of Najd were in past times, like most residents of Arab lands, mixed from various peoples, among them Arabs and Persians, Armenians and Hebrews, Assyrians and Chaldeans, Babylonians." Can you imagine anyone giving that type of definition of Najdi today? A mix, a hodgepodge of ethnicities from all over. That's how this is someone who dedicated his life and career to propounding a Najdi identity. And yet that's how he defined it, right? So you don't have a literature or a history of defining Najd. But then again, that brings me back to how I chose this topic. I had this concept or this idea that I wanted to pursue these ethnic Najdis, people that self-identified as Najdis but were living in Iraq. Their families had migrated there over time. They had built Salafi mosques. They were trading with their cousins back in the hinterland, and yet they were on the Iraqi side of the border. And when the border's drawn, they are cut off. So what happens to them over the decades up until the 1960s? They slowly migrate. They take Saudi citizenship, and Ibn Saud welcomes them in, and they form a technocratic class within Aramco and within the Royal Diwan. One or two of them end up in the Royal Diwan, and they welcome others to come join them. Why? They're highly educated. You had schools in Zubair at the secondary level, and even to some extent at the collegiate level, that you didn't have in central Najd. So these are people who are Sunni Arabs self-identifying as Najdi, seeing what Ibn Saud is doing as a source of pride, and they are willing to pack up and move. They don't see a future for themselves in Iraq. So they're welcomed in. This is exactly the type of migration that Ibn Saud is looking for, and he's happy to hand out second passports freely and openly. And we have records of that. We have people who record moments when he was doing this. So I was interested in that, and I said this to Al-Taraifi, and he turned to his assistant Musa and said, absolutely, you're going to work on that. We're going to give you all the help you can. Now, of course, Al-Taraifi was out of the job in about a year. I then saw Thamar al-Sabhan, who was a very interesting character, and I had a chance to talk to him here in Washington for about an hour. And he asked me, he said, I hear you're working on your PhD. And I laid out the concept for me. He grabbed my arm in a very gentlemanly way, and he said, absolutely, that's what you're going to work on. There are Zubairis in Riyadh today with their own majlis, who share old photographs and old pictures and get around and tell old stories. I'll introduce them to you, etc. Of course, Thamar al-Sabhan's a bit indisposed the last year or so he's not easy to get a hold of. But he's right. And I took this topic to the King Abdulaziz Foundation. We gave my summary of my proposed research to Dr. Fahad al-Samari, who told his people, of course, support this. It's one of those things I found. When you walk around Saudi Arabia and you tell people, I'm working on what you might call Greater Najd al-Kubra. Now, there is no concept Greater Najd. It doesn't exist. Nobody's written about this. It's not like Greater Syria, where there's this concept of Syrian populations across the Levant and a broader unity. And yet, when you go around Saudi Arabia and you tell people, this is what I'm working on, Najdi communities living beyond the borders, they immediately know what you're talking about. They have an instant recognition of this. They're very proud of this. They're very cognizant of it, even if they don't have a language for expressing it, much like you don't have a language for Najdi nationalism. How do you define Najdi nationalists? Well, in the mid-50s, under King Saud, you had a group of people that called themselves Najd al-Fatah, young Najd. These were people like Abdullah Tareki, who were senior government officials who believed, we're going to make Riyadh the centerpiece of this kingdom. It's going to be the center of commerce, the center of trade, the center of culture, etc. We're going to move all the ministries from Jeddah to Riyadh. It's going to be the center of government, because the Najd is the center of our identity. Those people had a short span in office. King Saud didn't last terribly long, yet they had an influence, I suppose, for a time being. So that's where this started, and that's where it began. But then how do you define Najdi national? How do you define the Najd? It's very difficult. And what I found, the more I read, the more I studied, was that so much of what it means to be Najdi was defined in its earliest days in the 1920s, when you began to have a literature, when you began to have political discourse, when you began to have newspapers. A lot of it was defined, the self, in terms of the other. And who is the other? It's Iraq, where you had a very strong sense of nationalism, where you had a very strong sense of national identity coming out of the 1920 revolution. And so the idea is that what they're doing in Riyadh is engaging with Iraq. It was the most frequent diplomatic correspondence they had with any country. These are both semi-independent Arab states at this point. Certainly Saudi Arabia is, and Iraq is on its path towards becoming that. And they have a sense of pride in the Arab world for that status, and the diplomatic engagement is intense between them. And it allows for these interactions with a different culture. Arab, yes. The government Sunni in Baghdad at the time, yes. And yet the politics wildly different, almost like an inverted image, like a black mirror. And that allows for this incredible reflectivity between the two societies. What starts in Saudi Arabia as a diversity of identities, a pluralism, okay, and with a state building effort at unification to bring these different identities together under a single banner, It's almost the opposite in Iraq, where you have a revolution in 1920 in which the common banner under which everyone is flying is national unity and national pride, defense against the British occupiers. Yet that devolves into pluralism, ethno-sectarian competition. It's moving in the exact opposite direction, almost to the horror of the Saudis down to the south. So there's this paradox, and it's part of the reason why the two countries really diverge. They just simply don't understand and can't appreciate. And when they do encounter each other's politics, they almost shudder in fear at the how radically different it is and how hard it is to comprehend.
Well, and that's what the different perspectives on those tribes, on that border. It seemed to me you took that where you have from the Saudi side. Let's have it. Let's go with traditional paths, with the traditional movement, and an amorphous type of demarcation, as opposed to the Iraqi side. I guess, as you point out in the book, sort of at British, with British encouragement. No, let's demarcate it hard and fast. And you said there were, three main baskets of issues. One was the status of the tribes. Two was criminal justice, and three, fortifications and outposts. And I gather that Saudi Arabia and Ibn Saud looked at it, as you say, the dark mirror, diametrically to what the Iraqis looked at it. And from what I understand from the book, and something that repeated itself throughout, that sort of set the tone for the relationship to this day.
The borders created barriers not just on the ground, but in people's minds. It was a barrier, the international border the British created, to the free flow of goods and services. So trade was immediately cut off. That was a threat to the new Saudi kingdom. So much of their trade in the central Najd depended on access to the coast. And that was done through Najdi traders living in Iraq and living in Jordan, living in Bahrain and in Kuwait. And Ibn Saud, to his credit, he's not given enough credit for his statecraft, did everything he could to lobby to maintain those networks. He was handing out passports in Kuwait and Bahrain. The British couldn't understand it. They were virulently opposed to it. They didn't appreciate the fact that he was doing it for a purpose. He was doing it to maintain the trade networks so that his people in Najd wouldn't be cut off from basic staples like rice. How else are they going to get it, right? And how are they going to pay the exorbitant customs fees that are now being imposed by the new protectorate governments on the coastal side? The barriers that were created by the borders, they cut off social networks. You now have families that have cousins across the border that can't interact the way they once did, can't intermarry the way they once did, can't trade the way they once did. Whereas once upon a time, a caravan coming in off the desert, loaded down with dates for sale, with camel lard and camel milk, basic goods that tribesmen would have that barely maintained their subsistence living. It didn't make much of a profit, but it made all they had, and they needed it to trade for vital goods at these trading outposts, Zubair, Suq Shayukh, Khamisiyah, etc. Well, the caravan comes in, and the first thing he does is try to find a tribal cousin, someone he trusts who's not going to rob him blind, someone who's not going to raise the prices on him because he knows these tribesmen are poor and they're desperate, and they only come in once a year when the season is good for the grazing, and that you can milk them for all they're worth for what little money they have. He's going to look for someone he trusts. Well, these borders and these barriers and the customs agents that are set up and the economic competition that's now created under government taxation oversight, this is a huge challenge to the economy, and Ibn Saud's doing everything he can. And it's a challenge to the social networking. And the third thing, these borders created a challenge to people's freedom to define their own identity. You look at a group like the Ukaylat. The Ukaylat, and there's a wonderful study by a scholar, Al-Ibrahim, who did this massive study in Arabic on the history of the entity that we know as the Ukaylat, showing that these were Najdis who migrated many, many years ago, many decades ago, but who retained their Najdi identity and set up trade routes between Damascus and Basra and Mecca and Medina and other places, Hayil, going back and forth, delivering the post, but also delivering vital goods. That these people their entire existence was predicated on their transnational nature, their ability to move beyond borders at will and freely. And the international barriers forced them to choose nationalities, forcing them to choose one place to live, to settle, to reside, which ended their way of life in many regards, right? So people's identities were bound up in their freedom to cross these lines in the sand that didn't exist until the British start enforcing them and encouraging governments like the Iraqis to start enforcing them. And all these things are challenges to Ibn Saud, who's trying to form a unity. He's trying to form a kingdom of a single identity, a single nature. And the British are encouraging all of his neighbors to cut the exact opposite way. And you can witness Ibn Saud at every step of the path, trying to come up with creative solutions. Can't we take the wells and the pastures on the Iraqi side, label them as to which tribe owns them, and then give the tribes free movement without visas, without passports, to be able to access them when they need them, to make the border a fuzzy border, just for the purposes of the tribal ownership of the pastures and the wells, so that they don't have to abandon their livelihood. And you can see his neighbors in Jordan and in Iraq absolutely rejecting this. We are modern states. We follow the British rules, and we want to be respected, and therefore an end to this lifestyle that will no longer exist. Sorry, go on, Richard.
Well, no, and beyond that, the other thing that, according to your book, that Ibn Saud didn't want to see was any kind of fortresses on the border, and the Iraqis in turn would build their fortresses on sources of water. So just exactly what you're saying. Not only would these tribes come to their traditional place for water and trade, they'd come and they'd found it, that an Iraqi fortress has been built on it.
So there were consequences to all of this, and consequences that play out till today. And a lot of that's not stated in the book, but I think Saudi readers and Iraqi readers who read the book will understand the effects that all of this had up until now. And that's part of what you wanted to talk about today, but we'll just do it in summary style. The failure of diplomacy in this period. Yeah, go on, Richard. You were going to interrupt.
Just, before you get into that, I'd love if a little discourse digression. So we had Ibn Saud, who was extremely sensitive to the traditional pathways and habits of the tribes, why he didn't want a fixed border. But he himself is trying to consolidate the country, and he has to deal with the Ikhwan, who present a particular challenge to the Iraqis as well. Can you just talk a little bit about that balancing act in terms of Ibn Saud and the Iraqis? Because that's, that all came to a head in the end of the 20s and involved the Iraqis, with that, with raids across the border. And it, in some ways, it as I understand from your book, it really reinforced the Iraqi commitment to hardening the border.
Look, at the time, there were all these accusations on the Iraqi side in the newspapers and the press and politics that what King Abdulaziz was doing was manipulating the situation, allowing these tribesmen to attack and retreat in order to apply political pressure on the Iraqi government. Scholars who have written about this relationship, Arab scholars, because this topic's never been really done in English before, but Arab scholars who came along, a lot of Iraqis and Palestinian or two, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, what they tried to emphasize was a bit more biased, a little more cold-hearted. They tried to depict King Abdulaziz as sort of the sheikh leader of the Ikhwan, who wants to raid and pillage for its own sake. What I try to do in the book is take a more nuanced approach and try to understand from King Abdulaziz's perspective what was the distinction here. There are times when a raid occurs, and he always apologizes. He was an incredibly diplomatic person. The minute a raid happened and it came to his attention, he would immediately fire off a letter to the British saying the loss of life is unacceptable and such violence should never be condoned. And I certainly had no role in this, and nor should I. I think what I do in my book is I say, well, there was a more nuanced way to understand all this, that King Abdulaziz didn't condone violence necessarily, but he made a distinction between military targets and non-military targets. There were particular attacks, for instance, on the site of Abigar in 1922. Spectacular attack, several people were killed. It became a cause célèbre in Iraqi politics. It became an excuse for clerics in Najaf and Karbala to protest in enormous conferences of thousands of people the need to replace the government in Baghdad. If the Sunni-led government in Baghdad can't protect us and their British allies are friends with King Abdulaziz, then they all need to go. The British need to go, the Sunni government in Baghdad needs to go, and we, the Shia clerics and our Shia political allies in Najaf and Karbala, we need to be running this country. It's the emergence of a sectarian discourse, and it happens with the Ikhwan raids as a lightning rod, as an inspiration for it. Something like that, where does it begin? Where is the impetus? Is King Abdulaziz responsible for this? What I try and say is not necessarily the Ikhwan and the tribes that they represent had interests of their own. These were border populations before there was a border, and they crossed over and dealt with their neighbors in their own way, and they didn't care for the border or what the border meant to them. They wanted to continue pursuing their localized interests, as all border communities do, until reality hits them in the head in the form of a national centralized government coming and beating them up. That being said, you can find something like the Abigar attack. You can find enough evidence to say that King Abdulaziz may have allowed it to happen, but why? In his mind and the minds of the folks in Riyadh, that was a military target. That was a fortified outpost that the Iraqis were using to militarize the border. They weren't just putting policemen out there, Birka Hajanna, these camel cavalry units. They were doing more than that. They were pre-positioning munitions for British Royal Air Force units, okay? And why do you need that? Well, you can argue the British simply wanted to police the Iraqi tribes to keep them from causing trouble and doing their own raids. But if you're sitting on the Najdi side of the border, I would clearly see a threat perception there. And I would imagine those RAF units are equally directed against my tribes and my people who are also conducting raids. Mm-hmm. And that's not allowed according to any of these treaties that had just been signed in 1921, 1922. It was very clear there will be no fortifications along the border. It's a demilitarized zone. That's, again, something that holds till today. The Saudi government, even today, envisions demilitarized zones on its northern and southern borders and has for many decades now. It's always had trouble winning agreement or concurrence from the Iraqi government or from the Yemeni government with Ali Abdullah Saleh for many years. They demanded, first it was a 5 kilometer, then a 15 kilometer, then a 30 kilometer DMZ. We're going to move the villages away from the border, etc. A lot easier to do on the Iraqi side where the Badia is so empty and so vacant, a little harder to do on the Yemeni side. But the Saudis really did try to implement that through the Ministry of Interior to try and move people back. And getting the Yemeni government to concur was almost impossible. I imagine they would want the same thing from the Houthis today if they were ever to recognize them as a legitimate government. That would be equally a challenge, no better succeeding there than they did with the Ali Abdullah Saleh government. But the point being that there's a significant difference between allowing the raid on Abigar in 1922, expressing regret for the loss of life, though admitting that the loss of life was largely among military personnel, okay? You may claim it's police personnel, but they served a dual role in those days. And a difference between that and some of the raids that were being undertaken in 1927, 1928, when eventually you lead to Sybilla and the confrontation between King Abdulaziz and the Ikhwan, at which point the Ikhwan have extended themselves too far, taken on too much initiative, gone after civilian targets in ways that only hurt the reputation of the Saudi kingdom. But suffice to say, there was a nuanced strategic understanding by King Abdulaziz as to what was permissible, what was not permissible. And there was both an ethical element to it and a military element to it, at least in his mind, from what I see. And it's complacent of historians to simply label all these things as quote unquote Wahhabi extremist violence. I can imagine feeling that way as a victim of such an attack. But from the Najdi perspective, you can make an argument that what the Iraqis had done was an escalation that could have led to war, and that this was tit for tat.
So I derailed you there, Josh. You were gonna bring us forward.
Well, look, some of the things that the subtext, right? There's a subtext. One is that what happens in this early formative period, okay, shapes a number of aspects of the kingdom and how the kingdom views itself, how the government behaves, interacts diplomatically and domestically. So number one is the Saudi style of diplomacy. I devote a section to this. You can find King Abdulaziz in the earliest days engaging directly in diplomacy, laying out specific demands and real creative strategies for tackling the problems, the bilateral issues. And you can watch step by step how he encounters obstacles, challenges, largely in the form of Nuri Said, but other politicians as well, that are engaged in their own politicking in Baghdad. He doesn't understand the internal dynamics of politics in Baghdad. He doesn't need to. It's not his job. But he does recognize that it's getting in the way of agreements, of meaningful agreements and confidence-building measures, which he's looking for. And you can increasingly see by the 1930s, King Abdulaziz retreating back into himself, adopting a more passive-aggressive approach to diplomatic engagement, so that meetings now begin with foreign interlocutors with an hour-long lecture about the history of the relations between our two countries, leaving maybe 5 minutes at the end for actual substantive discussion, in which King Abdulaziz doesn't want to commit himself to anything and doesn't make any promises. Now, a lot of diplomats around the world will lament that the way that they interact with senior Saudi interlocutors to this day, at that level, that it's very hard to get concrete promises and to get business done. But I would argue that's not a failing of the Saudi government. That's the result of a long history, a pattern of, in the early formative period, of attempts to constructively diplomatically engage and being thwarted or finding difficulty overcoming the political obstacles of the country that they're engaging with, which was largely Iraq in the earliest days. Mm-hmm. And they did some diplomacy with Iran, they did some diplomacy with a number of other countries, and the Soviets even. But Iraq was certainly the most intense action that they faced, and it shaped the way that they viewed. So then another aspect that emerged from all this is an understanding by the Saudi government of a world around them in which there are friends and enemies of the kingdom. There are friends of the kingdom and enemies of the kingdom. In the book, at least, I try to draw 3 different categories of the way that the Saudi government came to see friends of the kingdom, right? There were, first category, people who felt a professional duty to engage with Saudi Arabia. I go at length at Sabeh Nishat, who was a wonderful diplomatist and civil servant in the early days of the Iraqi government, who engaged with Saudi Arabia and negotiated treaties because he felt it was in the best interests of his country. He didn't pull any punches. He didn't play any games. It was his job to do it, and he did it well to the best of his abilities. There's a second category in Saudi minds. There were foreigners, foreign officials, foreign diplomats who engaged with Saudi Arabia because they had familial relationships. They had a family in Najd. They had a shared identity with Najd. And the very clear example of Abdulaziz al-Mandil. He's living in Zubair. He's running businesses in Basra. He becomes a member of the cabinet in Iraq in the early 1920s. Yet he sees himself as Najdi. And his family manages the business interests of King Abdulaziz in Iraq. Okay. When Ibn Saud first proposes the idea of a national oil company, and he has the concept of selling shares to Najdi, so it'll be a publicly held company, he authorizes Abdulaziz al-Mandil to be the representative for this entity in Iraq and to collect payouts and hand out shares, though the idea doesn't get very far in this early stage. But that was at least an idea that he had. And Abdulaziz al-Mandil, he is Zubairi with these types of family relationships in the Najd. So there was a reason for him to interact and engage on that level. And then there's a third category of friends of the kingdom, as the Saudis saw it. There were foreigners who only saw personal or political gain for engaging with the Saudis. And here we have Nuri Said, we have Rashid Ali al-Gailani, people who realized, if I can play my cards right, I can engage with the Saudis, go back to Baghdad, and spin it to my political favor or to my personal profit. These were fair weather friends. And these sort of mental categories of friends of the kingdom, I think you can still find them in Saudi discourse today. You can go to Riyadh and ask them what they think of this foreign leader, that foreign leader. And I think some people in Riyadh, at least, will still kind of throw around these terms and kind of view them in these categories. Some people will, at least. So getting back to then things that carry through to today. I think one thing that the Saudis learned in this formative period, engaging with these Najdi communities in Iraq and welcoming them to the Najd to take up citizenship and the like, they gained an appreciation that there are different constituencies within the kingdom that are unique and that need to be treated accordingly. That doesn't mean that there isn't a national identity being propounded by the Saudi government nationally. There is. You can look at the work recently of Michael Farquhar, his book Circuits of Faith. It's a fantastic book. Or you can look at Najd of Saman, Blood and Sand, which is an outstanding book as well, at ways that the discourse among different Najdi Salafi communities wants to spread or impose itself or influence the way that non-Najdi or non-traditionalist constituents view themselves. Yet I find, nonetheless, there's at least a recognition by the Saudi government in the early period, and that goes till today, that you have to let people in the provinces live their own lives. You can't fully impose a single order, the way, for instance, that Gamal Abdel Nasser tried to do in the provinces when he took power. You can't appoint your own local officials from the capital and change provincial politics wholesale. You can create governorate councils, and you have to allow local ayun, local notables, with their long-standing familial control over domestic politics in that corner of the kingdom, to maintain a presence on those governorate councils. And that holds true till today to some extent as well. I think in a more superficial sense, originating in that period and continuing through today, there's always a desire to engage Iraq. There's a feeling of a need to be part of what's going on in Iraq, especially to engage with the Sunni Arab communities in Iraq. But from a Saudi perspective, there's also this intense fear of getting too entangled in the politics of Iraq. So there's an ambivalence about it. But above all, and the last thing I'd say on this, in that formative period, there's an effort to create a single identity based on loyalty to the kingdom. That does exist. But again, it is balanced with a need to allow provincial communities to maintain their own sense of self and self-worth. And you can see that dichotomy, that thin line between the two playing out today between tradition and modernity. Look at what's going on with Niam up in the far northwest of the country. A lot of the local society there is going to be bulldozed. They've tried to choose a patch of territory where you have far less urban life and you have a lot more rural, empty land to work with, so that you're not disturbing local communities. But it's a challenge. It's if you go to Riyadh, even as they're doing these giga projects that will transform society and transform culture, you can watch on TV the latest programs, one of which is this wonderful guy who goes around to local communities all over the kingdom just to experience the games that the children play and the sayings of the elders and the foods that they eat. And it's one of the most popular programs you're going to get, cultural programs in Riyadh. It's absolutely fantastic. You learn about very localized society, something that could have never happened 10 years ago. Just 10 years ago, people in one corner of the kingdom had no clue how people in the other corner of the kingdom lived. And the government's trying to change that as well, at the same time that it's transforming how society is lived. Richard?
That's fascinating. You talked about Neom and the sort of the greenfield, although not entirely greenfield, but much less inhabited. But, they're having this challenge in Jeddah as they're trying to modernize and basically reconstruct whole swaths of Jeddah, and they're investing $20 billion, proposed. It's a real challenge at the ground level.
I remember going up to Tabuk once, meeting up with a friend, and we went to Hakl. Now, Hakl is the farthest northwest corner. It's right across from Aqaba and from Eilat. And on the hillsides up above Hakl, they've taken in green lights. They've projected verses from the Quran,
so you can see them in Israel.
In Eilat and Aqaba across the way. Although I think it's so far away that if you're sitting in those ports, you just see little green dots in the far distance, right?
You've got to read Arabic too.
It's very clever. And I remember going there and seeing Saudi citizens going for a late afternoon swim in the ocean, in the Red Sea. Fathers and sons going and playing in the ocean. It was wonderful in the sea. I went with a friend, and we went up to the fish market, because there were fathers with their sons fishing off the coast, and we saw them taking their fish to the fishmongers, largely Pakistanis and Indians, and selling them. We caught this today. We'd like to sell it. We had a good time fishing. Thank you. So we went and we asked, could we eat any of this? And they said, oh, absolutely. We'll cook it right here. Anything you like. You pick out which fresh fish you want of any sort, and we'll make it any way you like. And so we had the best meal of our lives. It was absolutely fantastic. And on the way out, we drove past the one site in town, which is the Funduk al-Rus al-Lubnani. We had a laugh at that. It was hilarious. And all that's going to be lost someday, and it's going to be sad. Why is it sad? Because these were things you'll never get anywhere else in the Gulf. I can't imagine having that experience. I mean, maybe you can in some way, shape, or form, but we were on the edge of
nowhere
of the world, and
yeah,
it wasn't nowhere, because when we were there, it became somewhere for us. Right. It felt not like you were in nowhere. It felt like you had slipped into another universe. It felt like you had slipped into the 1970s. If you want to think of it in terms of the rhetoric of Mohammed bin Salman, we slipped into a time before the Iranian Revolution, when life was a little bit different in Saudi Arabia. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not true, but at least it felt that way. And you felt like you were experiencing a traditional side of Saudi Arabia that might not be around too much longer. And that's something I would mourn. That's something I would regret to see lost, and I hope it's preserved.
I hear you. It seems inevitable that these things pass, much to our regret. You, in this book, you spent a lot of time with Ibn Saud. You did a lot of research. You delved deeply into what might be, and you couldn't always. I think you were very careful never to speculate too much. But what he was thinking, his frustrations, his hopes. Tell us a little bit about Ibn Saud. What was he like?
His dialect is fantastic. I absolutely love it. There's a ton of correspondence that survives. Okay. The problem is, from what I've seen, at least, more than half of it's probably written by Yusuf Yassin. And Yusuf Yassin, the court scribe and almost the chief of staff in the royal court in many ways, a very intelligent individual and a very delicate person in his correspondence. He translates what his boss, King Abdulaziz, is trying to say very professionally and very thoroughly, but he does it in a much more eloquent way. You can usually tell when Yusuf Yassin's writing the letter, but sometimes you can tell when he's taking dictation and he's writing verbatim on King Abdulaziz's orders. And then it gets a lot of fun translating. You get these passages like, your limb. It's saying he has been informed. What it's really saying is, what I'm telling you to do, and I'm not going to ask you twice. So whatever I'm ordering you to do, it's done. And he can say it all in one word. Okay, it's brilliant. Sometimes he swears in a delicate way. He'll say, for instance, in one letter, "Wallah, wallah, wa Rabbal Bayt." I swear by Allah, by Rabbal Bayt is a very strong term, by the master of Mecca, by the Lord of Mecca. He'll often do that when he wants to drive a point home and he's feeling very passionate about it. One thing I found contrary to all that, all these pan-Arab authors, these Iraqi authors, these Palestinian authors, when they try and talk about King Abdulaziz and his personality, they'll sort of ascribe all of these Arab nationalist views to him, all these ideas of pan-Arab glory. I find that's not the case at all. I find that he deploys that as a tactic, as a diplomatic tactic. He'll talk about the need to preserve the ummah, the need to preserve the Arab cause and the Muslim cause. He'll do it almost as a stalling tactic when he's not happy with the way diplomatic talks are going, or he's not happy with the way that his country is being treated by another government. And he'll do that to remind them, we are all brothers here, so we shouldn't be having these disputes. And you should be letting me, you should be listening to what I'm trying to tell you because there's a point to it. I find that it's a very delicate, very considered way of getting a point across and asking his interlocutors to think more carefully about what they're saying. It's not necessarily that he's propounding Islamic unity necessarily, though he may also have cared about that. That's not saying that he didn't. We're discussing all this today. I just want to be clear because this is we're doing this through the 966, which is the US-Saudi trade group. We could have this entire discussion that we're having right now about Iraq. Half the book is about politics in Iraq. And I hope we'll have a chance to do that in another forum, another day, talk about what this period, what Saudi meant for Iraq and what the Iraqis felt about all this. But since the topic and the audience today is Saudi focused, we're talking Saudi, and that's the point. Now, to say all that about Ibn Saud and everything we've said previously, what it means is that I've lent a greater strategic depth and strategic insight, a diplomatic sharpness to his thought and his thinking that you're not going to find in a lot of other writings. You're going to find such simplistic motivations mentioned in so many other authors. And what I've tried to do is resuscitate a nuance that doesn't exist in a lot of the literature, certainly not in the English language literature. And I hope that Saudi readers will appreciate that the way King Abdulaziz is portrayed in Western literature is very two-dimensional and very superficial in many regards. And I've tried to break through that and show that there's a personality here, and it's a deeply thinking one. He may not have been intensely educated in Western contexts, but he was a very sharp-minded individual who observed what went on around him and had a keen sense of how he fit into it.
I think you captured that. I think there's a sense, for those of us who educated just enough to not understand. Actually, you think of Ibn Saud as at the head of the White Army conquering the peninsula and subjugating the Hashemites and this and that, very almost territorial base. He did this, he got that, he finished that, and they consolidated in 1932. This really added dimension to him. And you mentioned, maybe he wasn't an Arab nationalist, but you could see him thinking in a larger picture. And where Saudi Arabia, again, even before it was 1932, even before it was officially a country, thinking about Saudi Arabia in the larger picture, how it stood within the globe and within the region.
And that's important. That's important even today. And that's another thing that comes out of this period and holds through very much till today. The Saudi government does not want to be treated as a leading Arab government or a first among Arab equals or even a dominant power within the Arab or in the Gulf region. It wants to be treated as an international player. King Abdulaziz wanted to be treated as a credible ruler in his own right. Not as a credible Arab ruler or a credible Muslim ruler, but as a credible ruler, period. As someone who was deserving and capable and should be treated by counterparts around the world as an equal. And that's just as true today as it was then. And it's not always appreciated by foreign governments and foreign publics.
I think that's fascinating you draw that parallel because that sentiment is very strong in Riyadh today. And that's an interesting arc that you draw, because we're talking from the 1920s to the 2020s. Fascinating.
That's King Faisal's career entirely. It's an effort to be treated with respect and an effort to be treated on parity. To some extent, That's King Fahd in his early days when he's crown prince and he's looking to carve out a portfolio of his own, define his own foreign policy agenda, even as crown prince. And then his early years in the early 80s, dealing with Lebanon, he doesn't want to engage with Lebanon in 1982 as one player among others, the Syrians and the Israelis, etc. He doesn't send Bandar bin Sultan as envoy to negotiate what at that time was Rafiq Hariri's first attempt to become prime minister and failed attempt at the time. He wants the kingdom to be seen by America and by the Soviets and by others as a key player internationally. He's not just engaging in these issues in Yemen and Lebanon in the early 1980s for the fun of it or for the sake of representing an Arab voice. He's doing it to be a player on the international stage, and this is what's at hand. This is the issue that's available to him. You can make the same case for Abdullah. This is why part of the reason why Abdullah sets up the interreligious and interfaith dialogue center in Vienna, because he wants to be seen as an international player. There are localized issues that have to be taken on in a localized context for King Abdullah. And that largely gets handled through the National Center for Dialogue, the King Abdullah Center for National Dialogue, and the annual events that they would hold on different topics that then would be discussed in the press so that Saudi society can have a chance to debate very sensitive issues like women's rights and roles in society. That was for a domestic audience, but there was another side to King Abdullah that wanted to be seen by the international community as on par, as an equal, as a player in that sense.
Josh, this has been
fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. Fascinating is a word.
I want to thank you, Richard. It's been fantastic. And I want to thank you for letting me come and do this.